is to work it out on the road. So you're going to go on tour again. Yeah. Do you hope?
Introduction to literature.
Right here.
There are lots of ways of answering the question, what is literature? In its broadest definition, the term literature could include anything from instruction manuals to advertisements. But in the following, the focus is on literature in the more traditional sense of texts written for artistic reasons rather than for practical, informative, or educational purposes. Literary genres. In this traditional definition, it's common to distinguish between three main branches of literature: fiction, drama, and poetry. Fiction is fairly easy to define. It's about telling stories. The word fictional is often used in the sense of made up, and indeed most fiction consists of made-up stories. However, the relationship between fiction and factual reality is often a complicated one, and the fact that a story is partly true doesn't disqualify it from belonging to the fiction genre. The important thing is that it's presented as a narrative. For the past few hundred years, fiction has generally meant prose writing, i.e., writing that follows the patterns of ordinary speech, without regular rhythm or rhyme. We can divide fiction into subgenres according to length, primarily novels and short stories, and according to subject matter, for example, crime, science fiction, fantasy, historical, etc. Drama too is about stories, but instead of telling a story, drama aims to show it. In other words, drama requires some sort of performance involving actors or puppets. Although a drama is usually a written text as well, it only really becomes drama when it's performed. 100 years ago, drama meant a theatrical performance, but film and television are the most common media for drama today. Once upon a time, poetry could be defined by such formal features as meter and rhyme. However, over the last century, free verse, i.e. poetry lacking regular meter or rhyme, has become more the rule than the exception, and our definition of poetry must therefore focus on the function and the aim of the writing. Poetry is the genre in which the focus of attention is on the language itself, its sounds and textures, its levels of meaning, its breadth of associations and connotations. The aim of poetry is to explore the world through language. This could, of course, be said about literature in general, but in poetry we meet language in its most intense, most concentrated form. As the American poet Robert Frost put it, poetry is what gets lost in translation. Interpreting literature. If you were given the task of writing a manual for a washing machine, what would your main priority be? Of course, it might be fun to try and be witty, entertaining, personal, or philosophical. The trouble is, this would most likely be at the expense of clarity. The important thing about a manual is that it should be as clear as possible. A manual that's open to interpretation is pretty worthless. That's why well-written manuals are also generally quite boring as reading matter. One of the features that the genres of literature have in common is that they're open to interpretation. For literature to be engaging, it has to reflect some of the complexity and mystery of life itself. And we all know that life requires interpretation. In fact, we spend a good deal of our time doing just that. Why did David look so upset this morning? Why didn't Kate turn up for practice last week? What is this essay task actually getting at? Am I really cut out to be a teacher? What on earth is the point of existence anyway? Life constantly requires us to interpret events and situations from the banal to the deeply philosophical. Literature mirrors this. In fact, literature often requires more interpretation because whereas real life is viewed through the lens of each individual, literature is filtered through another lens as well, the writer's. The writer may be from another age or another culture, which adds to the challenge and to the opportunity to broaden our own horizons. To interpret literature, we have to use our knowledge of the world and human nature, especially of ourselves, and at the same time be aware of the writer's intentions and attitudes. Why does the writer make the main character say that? What actually happens at the end of the story? What on earth is the point of this poem? It's therefore not surprising that interpretations of literature tend to differ at least as much as interpretations of life. The good news is that the two activities are mutually beneficial. That is why trying to understand literature is an excellent way of learning how to understand more of life itself.
I'm sorry. I don't know why I'm being like arrested for wearing pajamas on the business trip. They were not pajamas. It was silk lingerie. Okay, the fashion police is here. I didn't know I was going on a trip with Stacey London.
You guys, let's be careful not to police anyone's fashion.
Working with short stories. The term short story is self-explanatory. The main difference between a short story and a novel is that it's, you guessed it, shorter. But its shortness also means that there are some other differences. A short story usually has a smaller gallery of characters than its longer relation and focuses on fewer events and fewer themes. There is no time for digression or expansion. That doesn't mean that it's more lightweight or easier to write than a novel. On the contrary, as we shall see, the best short story writers are able to both fly high and dig deep in the space of a few pages. By focusing on a small segment of experience, a short story can often reveal something about life that surprises us. As one writer of the genre wrote, it can offer us that glimpse of truth for which you have forgotten to ask. Term 1. Plot. The question you are most likely to be asked about a book you have read or a film you have seen is what's it about? It's a very good question, but it's a little ambivalent. That is, it can be interpreted in two ways. Let us suppose that the question concerns the well-known fairy tale Little Red Riding Hood. Your most likely answer would probably begin with something like this. Well, it's about this little girl called Red Riding Hood who sets off to visit her grandmother in the forest. A short summary of the story, in other words. But there is a chance that you might be in an intellectual, psychoanalytical frame of mind when you were asked the question. In that case, you might answer something like this. It's about the dangers of growing up, the choices we face of either sticking to established paths or straying from them. These two very different responses to the same question sum up the difference between two important terms we use when writing about literature: plot and theme. We will deal with theme later. Plot versus story. In novels and short stories, we sometimes differentiate between the story and the plot. Put simply, the story is the events as they occur in the narrative. First this happens, and then that happens. Plot refers to the way these events are ordered and connected. In the case of Little Red Riding Hood, the story and the plot are more or less indistinguishable. Events are told in sequence, and nothing of significance is kept hidden from the reader. In modern literature, the relationship between the story and the plot is very often more complicated. In crime literature, for example, the whole point of the narrative is to keep aspects of the story hidden from the readers so that we are left guessing until the end. And most modern writers are fond of tinkering with chronology, using flashbacks and foreshadowing, so that connections and consequences are revealed gradually. Conflict and climax. Conflict is the stuff of stories. Without conflict, there can be no story. What would Little Red Riding Hood be without the wolf? And conflict requires at least one protagonist. We could also use the term main character, but protagonist is better because it implies action. The protagonist is the person who is at the center of the action, like Little Red Riding Hood in the fairy tale. Often, but not always, a story also involves an antagonist, that is, an opponent of the protagonist. Sometimes this is another character in the story, like the wolf in the fairy tale that confronts Little Red Riding Hood in the forest, or the culprit in a crime story. But the antagonist in a story can also be something less concrete, like an organization, or an abstract enemy like hunger or the forces of nature. The level of conflict in a story varies during the course of the narrative. Although plots vary greatly from short story to short story and from novel to novel, there is a basic pattern that can be found in many older works of prose fiction, as well as in film. This pattern, which has its origins in classical drama, can be presented in the following diagram. Exposition, rising suspense, climax, falling suspense, resolution. The crime story, sometimes referred to as the whodunit, is the modern fiction genre that follows this pattern most closely. In the exposition, the body is discovered and suspense rises as the wily detective pieces together the evidence. Suspense reaches a climax when the culprit is revealed and confronted. The climax is the turning point, followed by falling suspense as the detective, or the culprit, reveals how and why the crime was committed. Finally, with the culprit safely behind bars, balance is restored and the forces of law and order go for a well-earned drink up the pub. However, the climax of a short story, if it has one, and not all short stories do, doesn't have to be a moment of high drama. Sometimes the turning point of a story can be a quiet moment of insight for the main character, a glimpse of the truth, as we mentioned in the introduction. It is the moment when the course of the narrative and the life of the main character change and will never be quite the same again. This sort of quiet climax, or aha moment, is called an epiphany. See characterization below. Term 2. Setting. Human beings live in time and space. Sometimes we use stories to escape from time and place, like in fairy tales that begin once upon a time. But these are exceptions. Most stories happen somewhere and at some time. It's this where and when that we call setting. Setting comes from the verb to set, and we say, for example, that a story is set in Australia. Some stories show a remarkable flexibility when it comes to time and place. The same myths, legends, and fairy tales, for example, can be found in widely different cultures and in different centuries. But that doesn't mean that setting is not important. If we take the story of Little Red Riding Hood, for example, and set it in the world of big business, making Red Riding Hood herself a trainee chartered accountant and the wolf a ruthless real estate broker, we end up with a different story even though the basic plot remains unchanged. Indeed, when we think back to a story we have read, it's very often the setting we remember long after the plot has been forgotten. 3 aspects of setting. There are 3 aspects of setting. Firstly, there is geographical place. Its importance varies from text to text. Some stories are rooted in a particular landscape that is frequently described and actually has consequences for the events that occur. In a work like The Lord of the Rings, for example, geographical place, although imaginary, is so important that the books are equipped with maps. Here we follow the protagonist not just through life, but across a landscape. In other stories, geographical place may hardly be mentioned. The second aspect of setting is time. As a general rule, we can say that, unless writers indicate otherwise, the story they tell belongs in the present. But of course, the writer's present soon becomes our past, and later readers will have to keep their eyes open to find clues about what period we are dealing with. Such clues might be anything from technology, for example, a cassette Walkman or the lack of mobile phones, to popular culture, for example, a hit song, a dress fashion, or mention of a particular historical event or person. When writers place their story in another time than their own present, they are likely to be more conscious of the clues they leave. Historical novels have the difficult task of recreating a world that may not be familiar to the reader. Finally, there is the aspect of setting that we call social environment. If we say that a short story is set in a village in Yorkshire in the 1860s, we still have more to say. Does the story follow the fortunes of a coal miner and his family in their fight for survival? Or is it about the local landowner and his fox-hunting buddies? Although social differences may not be the focus of the novel or short story, there is no such thing as a neutral social environment, any more than there is a neutral place or time. The way characters speak, the lives they lead, the things they think are important. These are all aspects of social environment. Term 3. Characterization. Literature is generally about people. Even when it isn't, for example, when it's about rabbits, aliens, gods, or hobbits, it's about individuals who behave more or less like people. We call a person in a literary text a character, and some of the characters created by writers are far more fascinating than many real people. Hamlet, for example, may well have existed as a real person too, probably called Amleth. But it's Shakespeare's character, the brooding Prince of Denmark, that has achieved immortality. Fictional characters can become so real and important to us that we dream about them, call our children after them, even dress like them. In literature, as in real life, we talk about character traits, i.e., features of their personality. Direct and indirect characterization. The way in which a writer creates a character is called characterization, and there are two ways to go about this. The most obvious way is for the author to tell us what the character is like. Charlie Richardson was a boy of 17, with a face full of freckles, a mop of ginger hair, and the loudest laugh in the school. Kind-hearted and cheerful, he was popular with both the teachers and his fellow pupils. Charlie was someone you could rely on when the going got tough. We call this direct characterization, and it's the quickest way to establish a character. A variant of direct characterization is when a character is described by another character. Alternatively, the writer can show what traits characters have through the way they act and through the things they say. "No problem at all," cried Charlie, drawing back a mop of ginger hair from his freckled face. "Of course you can borrow my chemistry homework, but be warned, I'm absolutely hopeless at chemistry." He slapped me on the back and roared with laughter. This is called indirect characterization, and it's closer to the way we actually experience people in real life. Often, writers will combine these two modes of characterization, and, depending on the point of view they have chosen, they can also use the thought processes of their characters as a way of revealing their personalities. Flat and round characters. When talking about characters in a book, we sometimes use the adjectives flat and round. A flat character is one that is clearly and simply defined in terms of a few attributes. Think of the stock characters of some comedians or the characters in a situation comedy. You know how they will react in a given situation. They may have particular phrases or expressions that they always use in a particular gesture. Such characters are two-dimensional. They can be defined by a few traits, and it's difficult to imagine them outside the fictional world that they inhabit. A round character, on the other hand, is closer to the complexity of real life. Real people are full of paradoxes and surprises. Their motivations and responses are not always easy to interpret, and they can be pleasant in one situation and unpleasant in another. Round characters have at least some of this depth. Sometimes we can imagine them coming out of the pages of a book and living in the real world. However, we should beware of imagining that round characters means better literature than flat characters. It's very much a question of taste and of literary period. The novels of Charles Dickens, for example, are full of flat characters, and many of them are drawn with such colour and liveliness that they have become household names in English-speaking countries. Comic novels, too, tend to favour flat characters for their entertainment value. But protagonists in modern fiction are almost always round characters. Static and dynamic characters. Two more terms that are used about fictional characters are static and dynamic. A static character is one that does not change during the narrative. Flat characters are generally static. They would lose their flatness if they had the ability to develop. Whether a round character develops or not depends on how much focus he or she has in the narrative. Protagonists are usually dynamic characters. Part of the interest of a novel is to see how a protagonist copes with challenges and develops as a result of them. In many novels and short stories, there may also be a moment in the narrative when this change takes place. A turning point when the protagonist realizes that life has to change, that a long-held conviction has been mistaken, or that a new course has opened up. We call a moment like this an epiphany, and it often, but not always, coincides with the climax of the narrative. Term 4. Point of view. Point of view, also called narrative perspective, is the term we use for the way a narrator relates to the story he or she is telling. There are basically 4 choices we can make. We can tell the story by simply recounting the events that occur. If we, for example, were writing the story of Little Red Riding Hood, we could simply tell the story of what Red Riding Hood and the other characters did and said. The characters' thoughts and feelings would only be revealed through their actions and words. Alternatively, we could choose to tap into some of the thoughts and feelings of the main character. Her anxiety on meeting the wolf, her indecision about whether or not to leave the path and pick flowers, her thoughts when she finds her strangely hairy-faced grandmother in bed. Or we could also include this insight into thoughts and feelings to include other characters, for example, the wolf. So we would hear him deciding not to eat Red Riding Hood in the forest, but rather to wait until she arrives at her grandmother's house. Finally, we could let Red Riding Hood tell the story herself, or maybe let some other character tell it, the hunter, for example, or even the wolf, posthumously. These choices represent the 4 main types of point of view we meet in fiction. 1. The first is called the third-person objective point of view. Third person means the characters are referred to in the grammatical third person, that is, as he, she, and they. Here the narrator functions more or less like a film camera, recording events and speech, but offering no insight into the thought processes or feelings of the characters. In fact, we see them very much as we do people in real life, where we only learn of people's thoughts if they choose to share them with us. This type of point of view is actually quite rare in fiction, but it is very close to the way drama and film tell a story. 2. The second type is called the third-person limited point of view, and it is one of the most commonly used in modern fiction. Here we have access to the protagonist's thoughts and feelings, while other characters are seen only from the outside and through the filter of the protagonist's own evaluations. 3. The third type is called the third-person omniscient point of view. Omniscient means all-knowing, a word often used about God. In a story with this point of view, the narrator, godlike, has unlimited access to the thought processes of the characters. The reader is able to know about the feelings and intentions of the protagonist and everyone else in the story. 4. The last type is called the first-person point of view, meaning that the narrator is a participant in the story being told, and therefore uses the pronouns I and we. The narrator may be the protagonist, but can also be a minor character. A first-person narrator obviously has access to his or her own thoughts and feelings, but can only guess at the thoughts and feelings of others in the narrative. The point of view a writer chooses to narrate a story from has quite an impact on how the reader experiences the story, not least for the reliability of what is told. A third-person objective point of view inspires our confidence because we are basically left to our own judgment and understanding of events. The third-person omniscient point of view is also usually reliable. Since we have access to the thoughts of many characters, we feel confident that we are well informed, rather like observing a card game, where you can look over every player's shoulder to see what cards they have. At the other end of the scale is the first-person point of view. Here, there is no guarantee that the narrator's presentation of events can be relied on. It may be misinformed, prejudiced, or motivated by self-interest. Stories with unreliable narrators require an alert reader who reserves judgment and doesn't take everything at face value. Somewhere between these two positions, we find the third-person limited point of view. By limiting our access to the thought processes of one character, usually the protagonist, we get closer to this character and can identify with him or her. At the same time, we are aware that the character's understanding of things might be limited or mistaken. The author may purposely allow a discrepancy or disagreement between what the character thinks and what we suspect to be the case.
Sure.
Irony. Closely connected with point of view is the concept of irony. Put simply, irony is about the discrepancy between what is and what appears to be. If someone you know turns up covered in mud, having fallen in a ditch, and you say, "I see you've dressed for dinner," you are being ironic. You mean the opposite. You haven't dressed for dinner. In literature, irony can arise when a character, especially the one whose point of view we are seeing events from, interprets reality one way, while we, the readers, interpret it rather differently. It arises, for example, when a writer chooses a child as a first-person narrator. We see events as the child sees them, with all the misunderstandings that entails. But as adult readers, we can guess what is really going on. The discrepancy between what is presented and what we, the readers, perceive can be very subtle. There is, for example, an element of irony in the story The Prophet, when the narrator, first-person point of view, describes how we learned to place our hands on our neighbors' temples and free them from suffering. We healed wounds of karmic incarnations. We delivered astral liberation to our parents sitting in their living rooms, watching reports of us on TV. As opposed to the we in the story, we the readers have our suspicions about the credibility of these paranormal experiences. The result is to make the followers of the prophet seem ridiculous. Point of view refers to the perspective from which a story is told. We can use the metaphor of the camera. Whose lens are we viewing events through? Or the metaphor of voice can also be useful. Whose voice are we hearing in the narrative? An author often chooses a voice that she identifies with closely herself. But it is perfectly possible to make the opposite choice. That is when irony arises. The discerning reader senses that there is a distance between the author's intention and the voice we are hearing. We realize that the narrator cannot be trusted and that what is being told cannot be taken at face value. Term 5. Theme. As mentioned above, there are two interpretations of the question, what is this story about? One invites us to give a summary of what happens in the story. The other invites us to look below the surface of the story for themes. We can define a theme in a literary context as an idea or an aspect of life that keeps cropping up in a story, or that pervades the whole narrative. if we say that the Harry Potter novels are about the importance of friendship and knowing who you are, and that the Lord of the Rings trilogy